This is not a story of abandonment, but of a quiet surrender, born from desperation that gnawed at the edges of a family's will, a surrender whispered in the desolate winds sweeping across the Dakota plains. It is a testament to the profound, often brutal choices forced upon individuals by circumstance and misunderstanding, a narrative etched in the heart of a child whose world spun with colors and sounds others could not perceive. Her name, a murmur in the ancient tongue translated to Whispering Willow, though her voice rarely offered more than soft, unintelligible hums, her gaze often fixed on distant, unseen horizons. Her parents, caught in the cruel crucible of societal expectation and a profound lack of comprehension, watched their daughter, their Willow, drift further from their grasp with each passing day. They saw not a unique mind, but an insurmountable challenge, a burden whispered about in hushed tones by neighbors who measured normalcy by conformity. The world outside their small, struggling home offered no solace, no guidance, only judgment. Autism, a word barely understood, became a silent, relentless enemy, corroding the foundations of their love with exhaustion and fear. They were people worn thin by struggle, their compassion frayed, their hope a flickering flame in a gathering storm. They believed in their desperate, misguided hearts that they were making the only choice left to them, a choice that would echo with shame and sorrow through the barren landscape of their future. The concept of selling her was not a transaction of currency, but of release, a transfer of a responsibility they no longer believed they could bear. It was a handing over of a fragile, precious life to the unknown, a last, desperate gamble in a game they had long since lost. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable. The air was thick with unspoken grief and the faint, unsettling scent of an impending departure. Her small hands, always fluttering, always seeking textures unseen, reached for nothing, for no one, as the decision solidified around her like hardening clay. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The exchange occurred not in the shadowed alleyways of illicit deals, but beneath the vast, indifferent sky, at the edge of their struggling homestead where the dust devils danced with mocking glee. Her father, John, his face a mask of strained composure, his eyes hollowed by sleepless nights, stood beside the decrepit family wagon. Sarah, her mother, a woman once vibrant now reduced to a ghost of herself, clung to Willow's small hand, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the horizon, refusing to meet her daughter's translucent, unfocused stare. Willow herself, oblivious in her own world, traced patterns on the dusty ground with a twig, murmuring a melodic, tuneless song. Then a dark, weathered truck rumbled into view, kicking up a plume of red dust. From its cab emerged Elias Blackwood, a man carved from the very land he inhabited, his face a roadmap of sun-baked lines, his eyes deep pools of quiet observation. He was a Blackfoot rancher from the far stretches of the reservation, a man of few words, known for his solitary existence and his uncanny connection to the land and its creatures. There was no handshake, no formal agreement, only a shared, unspoken understanding of the tragedy unfolding. John cleared his throat, the sound raw and desperate. She needs more than we can give. His voice was a cracked whisper, devoid of its usual authority. Elias merely nodded, his gaze sweeping over Willow, lingering for a moment on her delicate features, her distant gaze. He held out a hand not to John but to Willow. Sarah's grip on her daughter faltered, then released. It was a release weighted with a terrible relief and a crushing guilt. Willow, startled by the unexpected touch, recoiled for a split second. Then, as if sensing something ancient and calm, she took Elias's calloused hand. It was a moment suspended in time, a tableau of quiet desperation and unexpected acceptance. The sun, a brutal eye in the sky, beat down on the scene, illuminating the fine dust motes dancing in the air, mirroring the silent, chaotic storm raging within each of them. The rancher led Willow to his truck, her tiny frame dwarfed by his imposing presence, yet moving with an odd, almost ethereal grace beside him. Her parents watched, frozen, as the truck turned, its tires crunching on the gravel, disappearing into the shimmering heat haze, carrying their child, their burden, their lost hope, into an uncertain future. A single tear, hot and heavy, finally traced a path down Sarah's dust-streaked cheek. The journey was a blur of shifting light and unfamiliar vibrations for Willow. The truck, a rumbling metal beast, carried her away from the only world she had ever known, depositing her into another that was equally vast, yet profoundly different. Elias, ever silent, drove with a deliberate slowness as if giving her time to absorb the changing landscape, the endless prairies giving way to rolling hills dotted with grazing horses. When they finally arrived, the ranch was not the grand, imposing structure one might imagine, but a cluster of weathered wooden buildings, nestled against a backdrop of ancient cottonwoods. The air here was cleaner, scented with pine and the sweet earthiness of undisturbed land. It hummed with the buzz of unseen insects and the distant lowing of cattle, a symphony of natural sounds that, surprisingly, did not overwhelm her. Stepping out of the truck, Willow found herself in a world of textures. The coarse gravel beneath her worn shoes, the rough-hewn wood of the porch, the soft, curious muzzle of a horse that ambled over to greet them. Elias simply observed her, his presence a quiet anchor in the swirling kaleidoscope of her senses. He led her into the small Spartan cabin, its interior dim and cool, smelling faintly of wood smoke and dried herbs. He showed her a small room, furnished with a simple cot and a window overlooking a sprawling pasture. There were no toys, no bright colors, none of the comforting chaos of her previous home, only stillness and the faint rhythmic sound of Elias's breathing. For the first few days, Willow existed in a state of suspended animation. She explored the cabin with tentative investigative touches, running her fingers along the grain of the wood, tracing the patterns in the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. She would spend hours staring out the window, mesmerized by the subtle shift of shadows on the land, the slow, deliberate movements of the horses. Elias, seemingly unfazed by her unusual habits, continued his ranch work, always within sight, always within earshot, a silent, watchful guardian. He never forced her to speak, never demanded eye contact, never tried to pull her into his world. He simply made space for hers. His patience was a steady, unwavering force, a stark contrast to the frayed nerves and desperate pleas that had characterized her former existence. It was in this quiet acceptance, this absence of pressure, that a tiny seed of something new began to stir within Willow, a fragile tendril of connection in the vast emptiness. The memories of her former home were fragmented, like shards of a broken mirror, reflecting distorted images of confusion and mounting despair. Her father, John, a man hardened by seasons of drought and relentless toil, had always struggled to reconcile the daughter he envisioned with the child she was. He had yearned for a robust, talkative girl who would help him on the farm, a daughter who mirrored his own blunt, practical nature. Willow, with her silent inward gaze and her aversion to touch, was an enigma he could neither solve nor embrace. His frustration, a slow-burning fire, often manifested as a stony silence, a withdrawal that spoke louder than any shout. Her mother, Sarah, carried the heavier burden of emotional exhaustion. She had tried, truly tried, to understand Willow's unique needs, to navigate the labyrinth of her daughter's sensory world. There had been moments, fleeting and precious, when Sarah felt a connection, a glimpse into the beauty of Willow's unburdened perception. But these moments were quickly overshadowed by the relentless demands of daily life, the judgmental stares of neighbors who whispered about the strange child and the crushing weight of their own poverty. She remembered a particularly brutal winter, the wind howling like a hungry wolf, the meager harvest long gone. Willow's sensitivities, heightened by the cold and the scarcity, had led to frequent, overwhelming meltdowns. Sarah, shivering and depleted, had found herself rocking her daughter for hours, not out of comfort, but out of a desperate need for the cries to cease, for the world to quiet down, if only for a moment. It was during these dark, desolate nights that the insidious idea began to take root, whispered in the cold, unfeeling breath of the wind. They had sought help, of course, but the small, isolated community offered none equipped to understand, let alone nurture, a child like Willow. The doctors they saw, overwhelmed themselves by the sheer breadth of human suffering, offered only vague pronouncements and shakes of their heads. The selling of Willow was not a monetary transaction, for there was no money to be gained, but a desperate final act of severing, a belief that perhaps, just perhaps, another could offer what they could not, a life, however unconventional, that might truly be lived. It was a choice born of profound desperation, a raw, ugly truth laid bare by the unforgiving landscape. Elias Blackwood was not a man given to grand gestures. His acts of kindness were woven into the very fabric of his daily life, as subtle and enduring as the prairie grass. He understood that Willow's world operated on a different rhythm, a different frequency. He never forced eye contact. A detail he'd noticed unnerved her. Instead, he would speak to the air, to the horses, to the distant hills, allowing his voice, a low rumble like distant thunder, to become a safe, consistent presence. He learned her patterns, the way her hand fluttered when she was overstimulated, the soft hum that signaled a moment of contentment. He noticed her fascination with the textures of nature, the rough bark of the cottonwoods, the smooth stones in the creek bed, the silky mane of a horse. He began to leave these things for her, small offerings on the porch, a silent invitation to explore, a particularly smooth river stone, a feather from a hawk, a perfectly symmetrical pine cone. One afternoon, he found her sitting by the horse corral, her small fingers tracing the patterns of dust on the fence post, her gaze fixed on a young mare. The mare, usually skittish with strangers, stood remarkably still, her dark eyes wide and calm. Elias approached slowly, holding a handful of oats. He extended his hand, not to Willow, but to the mare. "This one, she's quiet," he murmured, his voice a low thrum against the vast silence. Willow, without looking at him, slowly reached out her hand, not for the oats, but for the mare's muzzle. The horse, with an almost human gentleness, nuzzled her palm. It was a moment of profound, unspoken connection. This was Elias's way. He did not teach her to speak in words, but in the language of the land, of animals, of the subtle shifts in the wind. He would work in the fields, and she would sit nearby, sometimes humming, sometimes tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick. He built a small, sheltered space for her under an old, gnarled tree, a place where she could retreat when the world became too much. It was here, in the quiet embrace of the natural world, and in the patient, unwavering acceptance of Elias, that Willow began to unfurl, like a delicate desert flower after a long, parched season. Her hums became more varied, her movements a little less frantic. She was not fixed, for she was never broken, but she was finding a new rhythm, a way to move through the world that felt, for the first time, like home. The news of Elias Blackwood taking in a white child, let alone a child so different, spread through the sparse, interconnected communities like wildfire carried on a dry wind. Whispers, insidious and sharp, followed him whenever he ventured into town for supplies. The small general store, usually a hub of quiet camaraderie, would fall silent upon his entrance, eyes darting, shoulders hunching. The Blackfoot taking in a white girl? And that one too. She ain't right in the head. The words, though never directed at him, hung heavy in the air, a poisonous miasma of prejudice and ignorance. A particularly vocal rancher, Jebediah Thorne, a man whose face was as craggy as the Badlands and whose opinions were just as unyielding, often made his disdain known. What's he want with that one? Probably some kind of government scheme or worse. Jebediah's words carried weight among a certain faction, those who viewed indigenous people with suspicion and anything outside their narrow understanding with fear. One sweltering afternoon, Elias had brought Willow with him to the store. She, true to her nature, was captivated by a shaft of sunlight streaming through a dusty window, dancing with invisible motes. She spun slowly, her small hands reaching, her face alight with an internal joy no one else could see. Jebediah, witnessing this, let out a sneering laugh. "Look at her, prancing about like a mad dog. He ought to keep her penned up." Elias, who had always met such slurs with a stoic silence, turned slowly. His gaze, usually calm, held an unsettling intensity. "She is a child of the Creator," he said, his voice low, deliberate, cutting through the thick silence of the store. "And she is exactly where she needs to be." His words were not a challenge, but a statement of immutable truth, delivered with the quiet authority of the land itself. The store manager, a nervous man named Silas, quickly intervened, ushering Elias to the counter. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with unspoken hostilities. This brief, charged encounter solidified Elias's reputation as both an enigma and a protector. It also highlighted the precariousness of Willow's new life. She was not just a child with autism. She was a Dakota child in the care of a Blackfoot man, a living symbol of defiance against deeply entrenched societal biases. The ranch, once merely a refuge, now became a fortress, a last bastion against a world that sought to categorize, to judge, and ultimately, to dismiss that which it did not understand. The vastness of Elias Blackwood's patience was not born of saintliness, but of a profound personal sorrow, a knowledge of loss that had carved deep ravines in his spirit. He had once had a daughter, a girl named Ayanna, whose spirit, much like Willow's, danced to a different drumbeat. Ayanna, born with a rare neurological condition, saw the world in fragmented visions, spoke in a language only the wind understood, and communed with the spirits of the land in ways Elias, even with his deep cultural roots, could barely fathom. He had sought healing for her, consulted elders, journeyed to distant medicine men, but Ayanna's path was her own. She lived a short, incandescent life, a beacon of otherworldly light before she quietly slipped away during a harsh winter, her spirit returning to the earth from which it came. Elias had carried that grief, heavy and unyielding, for decades. He saw in Willow's wide, searching eyes, in her quiet hums and her solitary dances, echoes of his lost Ayanna. It was not a replacement, never that, but a resonance, a chance to offer the understanding and acceptance he had strived to give his own child. He remembered the sting of the white doctor's dismissive words, their inability to see Ayanna's spirit beyond her failing body, their attempts to force her into a mold she could not fit. He understood the desperate, misguided choices born of such ignorance. So, when he heard whispers of a Dakota family struggling with a strange child, a child they considered broken, something stirred within him. It was a call to protect, to nurture, to offer a sanctuary. He had heard of Willow's parents' plight, their quiet desperation. He knew that for many indigenous families, the struggle with such conditions was compounded by a healthcare system that often failed them, by cultural misunderstandings, and by the lingering trauma of generations. He didn't judge Willow's parents. He understood the overwhelming forces that had pushed them to their breaking point. His taking Willow in was not an act of charity, but of kinship, a quiet affirmation of his responsibility to the land and its people, a spiritual obligation to a child who reminded him so powerfully of his own. He was not just a rancher. He was a guardian of lost spirits, a keeper of forgotten rhythms, offering a refuge where fragmented souls could find their whole. The precarious peace of the ranch, a fragile haven built on quiet understanding, was suddenly shattered by a distant rumble, not of thunder, but of an approaching storm of human design. Word reached Elias that John and Sarah, Willow's parents, were trying to reclaim her, not out of renewed love or understanding, but out of a desperate fear of judgment and the lingering whispers of townspeople. A government agent, a man driven by rigid protocol rather than genuine concern, had heard the rumors and was now questioning the legality of Willow's informal placement. He saw not a child finding solace, but a transaction outside the bounds of law, a potential exploitation. This man, Mr. Abernathy, represented the cold, unfeeling bureaucracy that often stripped away the humanity from complex situations. His arrival at the ranch was announced by the unwelcome crunch of tires on the gravel, a sound that pierced the natural symphony of the prairie. Willow, usually oblivious to such intrusions, felt the shift in the air, a tension that vibrated through the earth itself. She retreated to her special place under the old cottonwood, her humming ceasing, her body tensing. Abernathy, a man in a crisp suit entirely out of place in the rustic setting, spoke with an air of clinical detachment, his words laced with veiled threats about custody, neglect, and the welfare of the child. He questioned Elias's motives, his suitability as a guardian, his very right to shelter a child of a different heritage. "You are not a legal guardian, Mr. Blackwood. This child needs to be placed in an environment where her needs can be properly assessed and met." a proper home. His gaze, dismissive and condescending, swept over the ranch, seeing only poverty and isolation, where Elias saw abundance and peace. Elias, his face impassive, listened to the onslaught, his eyes betraying nothing. But beneath the surface, a quiet fury simmered. He knew what proper homes often meant for children like Willow: institutions, cold assessments, a stripping away of their unique spirit. He remembered Ayanna, the way the world had tried to contain her, to change her, to extinguish her inner light. This was not just about Willow. It was about every child deemed other, every soul pushed to the margins by a society that valued conformity above all else. The air thickened with unspoken battle lines, the calm of the prairie giving way to the stark, unsettling tension of an impending confrontation. The morning of the decisive meeting was shrouded in a heavy mist, clinging to the prairie like a shroud, mirroring the palpable tension that hung over the ranch. Mr. Abernathy, accompanied by a local sheriff, arrived punctually, their presence a jarring intrusion on the quiet rhythms of Elias's world. Willow, sensing the shift in Elias's demeanor, the subtle tightening around his eyes, became unusually agitated. Her humming grew louder, more frantic, her small hands fluttering like trapped birds. Elias, knowing this was the moment, led her gently to the cabin porch, where Abernathy and the sheriff stood, their faces grim. Abernathy began, his voice official and cold. "Mr. Blackwood, we are here to take the child. Her parents have indicated a desire for her to receive state-mandated care, and your arrangement is irregular." Willow, hearing the tone, not the words, pressed herself against Elias's leg, her gaze fixed on Abernathy's shiny shoes, then up to the sheriff's stern face. She began to rock, a rapid, repetitive movement that spoke volumes of her distress. Elias knelt, placing a hand on her shoulder. His voice, though low, resonated with an unwavering strength. "You see what this does to her. You see what state-mandated care has done to others like her. I have offered her a place where she is understood, where she is safe, where she is free." Abernathy scoffed. "Understood? She needs professionals, Mr. Blackwood, not some rustic fantasy." It was then, in a moment of raw, untamed clarity, that Willow did something unexpected. She straightened, pulling away from Elias's leg. Her eyes, usually unfocused, locked onto Abernathy's. She let out a piercing, wordless cry, a sound of pure, unadulterated distress that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the mist. And then, surprisingly, she pointed, not at Abernathy, but at a distant flock of cranes, rising from the mist-shrouded pond, their calls echoing eerily. She began to hum, a soft, melodic tune, a stark contrast to her earlier cry, and slowly, deliberately, she extended her hand, palm up, towards the flock, as if inviting them to her. It was a gesture of profound, innocent grace, a silent declaration of her unique world, her unburdened spirit. Elias, understanding, spoke. "She sees the world differently. She hears its songs. You cannot cage a bird that knows the sky." Abernathy, momentarily stunned by Willow's unexpected display, found his clinical detachment faltering. The sheriff, a grizzled man who had seen much of life's cruelty, shifted uncomfortably, a flicker of something akin to awe or perhaps unease crossing his face. The moment hung, heavy and pregnant, with the weight of her truth, her silent defiance against their rigid order. The confrontation, stripped bare by Willow's raw, unexpected display, ended not with a bang, but a quiet, almost imperceptible retreat. Mr. Abernathy, his professional facade momentarily cracked, found himself without a coherent response to a truth that transcended his regulations. The sheriff, a man more accustomed to the clear-cut lines of right and wrong, found himself swayed by the undeniable innocence and vulnerability he had witnessed. He muttered something about unforeseen circumstances and unique situations, his gaze lingering on Willow, who had returned to her gentle hum, now tracing patterns on the dewy porch railing. Abernathy, defeated by the sheer emotional weight of the moment, retreated to his vehicle, muttering about reporting back and further considerations, though his tone lacked its earlier conviction. The threat, for now, had receded. John and Sarah, Willow's parents, never came to the ranch. They received a terse communication from Abernathy, detailing the unusual circumstances and the lack of immediate actionability regarding Willow's custody. Perhaps in their own way, they understood that she had found a place they could never have provided. Perhaps a small sliver of relief, laced with regret, settled in their weary hearts. Willow, though she had not spoken a single word, had articulated her truth more powerfully than any speech. She had shown them a world where silence was not absence, and difference was not defect. In the days and weeks that followed, a deeper calm settled over the ranch. The incident had solidified the bond between Elias and Willow, forging it in the crucible of external threat. She no longer retreated as readily into herself, occasionally reaching for Elias's hand, a tentative, fleeting touch that spoke of trust. She would follow him around the ranch, a silent shadow, her gaze absorbing every detail, every nuance of the natural world he navigated with such ease. He, in turn, allowed her to participate in small ways, letting her feed the horses or gather eggs, tasks she approached with a focused intensity that bordered on reverence. The ranch was not just a physical space, it was a living, breathing entity, a sanctuary shaped by Elias's quiet wisdom and Willow's burgeoning spirit. It was a place where the lines between human and animal, land and sky, blurred into a harmonious whole. The world outside, with its judgments and its misunderstandings, now seemed distant, a faint echo against the vibrant, life-affirming symphony of their shared existence. The Dakota winds, which had once carried the whispers of her abandonment, now sang a different tune, a song of resilience and belonging. Willow, no longer merely surviving, was blossoming. Her hums, once solitary and introspective, now carried a distinct rhythm, often mirroring the cadence of the horse's gallop or the rustle of leaves in the cottonwoods. She still moved through the world with her unique sensory awareness, but now there was a quiet confidence in her steps, a newfound ease in her silent interactions. She would spend hours by the creek, captivated by the play of light on water, her fingers tracing invisible patterns in the air, a silent artist composing symphonies only she could hear. Elias would often find her there, his presence a comforting weight in her periphery, never intrusive. He had taught her, not through words, but through shared silence and patient observation, the ancient wisdom of the land. He showed her how to read the clouds for rain, how to listen to the whispers of the prairie dogs, how to find solace in the vast open sky. She learned the names of the plants, the calls of the birds, the subtle language of the horses. Her hands, once prone to frantic movements, now moved with a deliberate grace, whether stroking the velvety muzzle of a foal or carefully collecting wild berries. The ranch, once a place of stark transition, had become the undeniable center of her universe. It was here, in the heart of the Blackfoot lands, under the watchful eye of a quiet, compassionate man, that she found her voice, not in spoken words, but in the eloquent language of her actions, her presence, her being. The societal biases, the initial fear, the judgment, they were still out there lurking in the shadows beyond the ranch's fence lines. But within their haven, they held no power. Elias had built more than a home. He had cultivated a space of unconditional acceptance, a fertile ground for a spirit that thrived on authenticity. Willow, the child her parents could not understand, the child sold to escape a burden, had not been broken. Instead, she had been forged anew, stronger and more radiant in the quiet fire of an unexpected love. Her story was not just one of survival, but of profound transformation, a testament to the enduring power of compassion and the universal need for a place where one is not merely tolerated, but truly seen, truly cherished, for exactly who they are. The wind carried her silent song, a melody of hope across the endless plains, a promise of a future rooted deeply in the ancient, nurturing earth.